Okay, so Shruti Kamble and I did the interview with Carl Jung this morning, and it was the longest of our interviews so far. It went on for about 90 minutes, and I thought it was one of the best. And I'm really disappointed that my Skype recorder failed. I don't know what's wrong with it, but it glitched, and it only saved the last 25 minutes of the interview, which I've posted, of course, on YouTube. So I thought what I should do. Because I thought some of the things that he said were really interesting and should not be lost. So I'm going to do my best. I have my list of questions that I asked him, so I'll read those, and then I'll do my best to try to synopsize what his responses were. I know this is a little stale. It's not as good as the real thing, but I thought some of the stuff he said was pretty interesting. So let's see. He came on, and Shruti said that she had been in contact with him actually for a couple of weeks. He's been popping up on her radar ever since we planned to do this. And he just seemed, she said, like a kind of a larger-than-life personality, very enthusiastic about doing the interview. So he came on, and I asked what we should call him. I thought Dr. Jung would be appropriate. He said, no, Carl. Okay, so I called him Carl through the interview. And then the first question I asked was about his relationship with Freud. I said, your relationship with Freud was fraught with a lot of difficulties, but I know that there was, from reading the Freud-Jung letters, I know that there was one thing that, for instance, David Cronenberg's movie, A Dangerous Method, left out. A very important piece of evidence about why their relationship disintegrated was the fact that Jung knew that Freud was sleeping with his wife's sister. So they had a triangle going on there. And I guess Freud didn't like Jung knowing that, or he felt threatened by it. And I asked Jung, I said, was this because this is left out of the movie, and the movie just talks about your debates back and forth on myth interpretation and so forth, wasn't that a really important factor? I mean, was it like the main reason for the falling out, or what? And or was it more complex than that? And he said, no, it was more complex than that. It had a lot to do with Freud's inflexibility. He was very rigid, very much wanted to present himself as an authority figure, and he was just very rigid about ideas, and he didn't like being confronted, especially with Jung's, what he dismissed as Jung's the black tide of mud of the occult that he saw Jung being fascinated with. Freud was an atheist and a materialist, and I don't think that he just didn't care for Jung's dabblings in the occult. So Jung told us that it was more complex than that. So then I asked him about his affair with Sabine Spielrein. I said, she seems to have introduced S&M to you, and I wondered about the effect that might have had on his marriage at the time. And I also wondered why his wife put up with the affair and didn't divorce him. And he said because his wife very much was interested in his work and didn't want to walk away from that. Her mind was mentally stimulated by him, and she didn't want to walk away from that. She wanted to stay in that relationship with him and be Jung's wife. And there were a lot of social, reputational issues around that that were more important to her, I guess, than all the calamity that would have followed with a divorce. And so then I asked basically the same question about Toni Wolff when she appeared in his life, became basically his second wife. He stayed married to his wife, and then Toni Wolff was his mistress, and the three of them apparently had an understanding. And I said, was it the same basic situation? And he said, yes. She just didn't want to divorce me. She liked my work. She liked the ideas. She was stimulated by it all, and we came to an arrangement. So Jung was basically a polygamist for his life there. And so then I asked him that about his model of male-female relations, especially his model in terms of which the male psyche, he has this idea that the male psyche is very good at thinking, just in general. It differs from individuals, of course, but in general he associates, he sets up a metaphysical bivalent ontology with this primary opposition between man equals thinking, woman equals feeling. And that is very problematic in today's culture, I think. And then he has the idea, of course, that the man is very good at thinking, whereas he says that women who have intellects, it's often a regrettable situation. He's very chauvinist, I think. And that the man has an inferior female side of his personality, the anima, and that is associated with inferior feeling, with stuff like sentimentality, for instance. A lot of times men are sugary, sweet, sentimental in a way that's off-putting. Women have the developed emotions, and their animus, the man inside of her, is then associated with inferior thinking, opinions, opinionating. Women do, I've noticed a lot of them do get, if you get an animus-possessed woman, she does opinionate a lot, and there's no reasoning with those opinions. They're just spouted out as though they were gospel truths, and you can't get around them. So his model is that anytime a couple is interacting, with a man with a woman, there's actually another couple involved. So there's actually 4 partners going on, or 4 two couples interacting. So I said, doesn't this model seem a bit sexist? I mean, nowadays, with the rise of feminism, especially stuff like radical feminism and all of that, doesn't this seem old-fashioned and out of date to you? And he said, no, he thinks the model still applies. He thinks it's generally right and basically true, and that there are plenty of exceptions to it. And I said, is there a way then, you seem to have this idea that the individuation process, the process of becoming a unique individual requires a relation to the other. Does it always require, I asked him, a male-female interaction, or at least it can be same-sex or whatever, but it's always like a kind of a sexual relationship. He said that, I remember him writing that the quickest way to access the contents of the unconscious is through contact with the opposite sex. And he said, no, individuation can be done without this. It doesn't necessarily require a love relationship for it to take place. And certainly we have to have respect for homosexual relationships as well. So then we moved on to, I asked him about his influence on the field of myth studies, which I think has been disastrous. And I think that he, perhaps not intentionally, but pretty much single-handedly destroyed the field by having a theory that was so comprehensive and good and very useful, but it became dogmatic and I think trapped everybody inside this Jungian dome to the point that anyone who approaches myth studies basically thinks that it's all Jungian and that it's all archetypes. Myths are not, they don't refer to anything that's real. They're all symbols and metaphors. This was Campbell's approach, for instance. And I felt that was too rigid and dogmatic. And what eventually turned me off of Jung and made me go elsewhere was this dogmatic interpretation of myth studies, because there's lots of other stuff going on in myths, such as with Hamlet's Mill, Herta von Dächen finding out that there are all these buried astronomical structures, or with Immanuel Velikovsky realizing that though much of his work was wrong, he was basically right that many myths do contain memories of traumatic historical events and catastrophes that are just carried on historically down the generations. There's a lot of other stuff going on in myths, and certainly with Rudolf Steiner and his idea that spiritual beings are real. There is such a thing as an Archangel Michael or an Angel Gabriel. Those are real beings. The names that we put on them don't matter. They don't have any relationship to what we call them. They're just these higher beings, and they're real. They're not just trapped inside of stories. They have an ontological validity to them that I think Jung missed. And I remember one time somebody sending him a letter saying, Dr. Jung, what do you think of Rudolf Steiner? And he wrote back one line, I have not the slightest use for him. So I think that was a limitation there. But Jung said, well, no, yes and no, that he thought what he came up with was pretty good and pretty useful. The archetypes of the collective unconscious, certainly everyone agrees that's a very useful concept. But he did say that basically, yeah, myth now needs to be looked at in a different way. People need to see new things in them. There are lots of new myths coming into being right now. I asked him, do you see any new myths? Like, for example, do you see a global myth coming into being? Is that a possibility that could become the basis for, let's say, a global religion for the first time in history? And then Shruti said, well, he's talking about aliens and the possibility that something about the alien extraterrestrial myth, mythologum as he would have called it, might have something to do with that. So it would be something that might be based on that or might come out of that. And I said, Dr. Jung, I know you wrote this book on flying saucers, a modern myth, where you treated it as a myth, but is it real? I mean, is it the case that this Eric kid, for instance, is very emphatic that it is real, that aliens do visit us, they are abducting people, and so I wanted to get a straight answer from him, and he wouldn't give us one. He was cagey about it. She says, he's not answering me for some reason. And so I said, mum's the word on that then, I guess. So I don't know. Now, I wondered about the current disastrous relations between the sexes with the At Me Too movement. Every day, some man is now being accused of sexual misconduct by some woman, more and more and more all the time. The relations between the sexes seem pretty bad right now, on very, very shaky ground. And I asked him whether he thought the rise and spread of pornography has anything to do with this. And he said, no, it's not pornography. It's the media itself. He didn't use this term, but Jung Han, I like this term. I took it from him. It's all this shitstorm media, and a shitstorm that's constantly going on with click of the button, people clicking on their button, doing instant character assassinations on people because they don't have any consequences. They're not in any localized relationship on a one-to-one basis with anyone, so you can get away with saying anything about anyone and be safe. No one's going to bother you. You can walk away from it. So we get all this irrational knee-jerk opinionating going on, like what happened with the Roseanne scandal, where she lost her entire show for one idiotic tweet that she made that she should not have made. And then within 3 hours, just a click of a button, and within 3 hours, that show's gone. All those people are out of work. That's ridiculous. I'm sorry, that's totally ridiculous. Had that happened before the internet, back in the day of the 3 networks and whatever, there would have been a long discussion and debate period. Executives would have met. They would have talked it out. They would have come up with another strategy. It would have gone on for weeks while they negotiated. People's tempers calmed down. We don't have that anymore. We're not giving people the space now to calm the fuck down over the simplest, slightest little affront or the slightest little thing. And suddenly everybody's flying around going crazy. And so Jung was saying that he thinks this new media, what I call the new media invasion, is having a very disastrous and destabilizing effect, not just on the relations between men and women, but on the whole social situation. So then I asked him this question about how the Hindus also became obsessed with pornography at the tail end of their great creative period around 1000 AD. That's when they start wrapping up all the great creative achievements. And they became obsessed with porn during that period from about, 800 or 900 AD down to about 1200, where at buildings like at Khajuraho and Bhubaneswara and the rise and spread of tantric sex cults, on these buildings, there are just pornographic, if you've never seen them, look them up. They look like cathedrals with saints all over them until you start looking closer and you see that it's every conceivable sexual perversion that you can think of in every position, even some that you probably never even knew were possible. They're everywhere. And you can imagine these guys sitting there with their chisels, hammering away at these explicit sexual scenes that must have taken them months and months and months to carve on this. A lot of effort and is going into thinking about sex and meditating on it. And so I asked him, and he said, well, it just was the case that the Hindus had reached a point where sexuality for them was something that was rising to the surface, kind of as it is in our culture, just rising to the surface and coming out into the open as a valid mode of being human. And so they wanted to include that too, that mode of being sexual, and hominid sexuality is quite inventive. As we'll get to in a second, I asked him some questions about our hominid human sexuality and how creative it is. And it was just coming out, and they were just focusing on it, and it was just a development that was happening where they wanted to include it. Whereas Christianity, by contrast, is, of course, disincluded. They did the exact opposite. They disincluded sexuality from their cosmological purview of what's good and condemned it to the realm of what's bad. And consequently, the West has been pretty neurotic about sex for quite a long time. We've had witch hunts, witch burnings, all kinds of crazy shit that has resulted from the repression of our sexuality. When you repress something, of course, an axiom of psychotherapy goes, it returns in demonic form, in a form that is aggressive and negative. So that was his question. That was how he answered that. And I said, monogamy seems to have been an invention of the West. It's very much more recent than polygamy. Monogamy seems to have been by the Greeks and then followed by our Faustian Northern European civilization as the basic mode, whereas polygamy has been the norm. All through history, polygamy has been, whether you think about the biblical patriarchs, Jacob wandering around with his two wives, Rachel and Leah, they always seem to, Islam, you can have 3 or 4 wives, that's the basic default mode. This goes way, way back. And so I asked him, is polygamy then the more natural mode of, as it were, human sexual orientation, whereas monogamy is more artificial? It's a cultural mode that is a bit more repressive on these natural instincts of men to want to have multiple wives. And he said, yes, actually, I mean, yeah, that's correct. Polygamy is the older form, and it goes way, way back, and it's probably the oldest form of the way that men and women had relations. And I asked him, was this the case even in the Paleolithic with the caves? And he said, yes, it was. They were polygamous even then, back in the Paleolithic with the caves. So polygamy goes way, way back. And monogamy does seem to be an artifice that the West came up with, maybe as part, as Joseph Campbell used to say, of the West's metaphysical emphasis on the uniqueness of individuality and the uniqueness of the one-on-one love relationship of amor, which has nothing to do with eros. It's a sort of sublimation of eros and transformation of it into recognizing your soulmate and having the concept of a soulmate. It's a much more romanticized vision of male and female relations and more, I think, metaphysically inclined. I find it more interesting, to be honest. I think it's more, it's just more fascinating. Then I asked him this dangerous question, some people are probably going to give me trouble about female promiscuity. I said that most of these civilizations, Islam is a classic obvious example, but most of them have really been repressive about female sexuality and not allowing promiscuity. And if promiscuity happens, usually there are dire consequences and results. We think of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, or we think of that movie, The Stoning of Soraya M., that came out not too long ago, based on a true story about the woman in Iran, I think in the 70s, living in a little village, who was falsely accused of adultery, but they stoned her to death. So cultures have been very, very fiercely repressive. And of course, they've been all patriarchal and lots of misogyny in there as well, of course. We have to grant that. But what I wanted to do was try to get the roots of that fear. What are the roots of the fear of female promiscuity? Is it perceived as a socially destabilizing force? And if so, why? They said, yes, he thinks that it is a socially destabilizing thing. And the reason for that is because men are, he says, hardwired for sexual jealousy in a way that women are not. Women, he says, women can sleep with a man and then that another woman could sleep with, and they might not experience the same kinds of sexual jealousy that he says that men are hardwired for. And I asked why, and he said because it has to do with the male urge to propagate his genes and the relationship to the offspring. The man wants to be sure that the kid that he has reproduced, that he produced with his woman, is his. And he can't do that if she's had multiple lovers. If she's had a bunch of lovers, then the genetics get very confusing, and the male ego simply wants to propagate genes and multiply the species. This is also why they're polygamous, why men are both sexually possessive and jealous, and at the same time polygamous. They want to spread their genes. So this is why it's been perceived as a socially destabilizing force. Of course, in the West now, we're acceptive of it, and we want it, apparently, or it wouldn't be happening. But I wonder about some of these things. So that was his response to that. Then I said, traditional gender roles in our society do now seem to be liquefying. There's a lot of men, for instance, that want to be perceived as female or I guess we call them transvestites. There's a politically incorrect term that I won't use here, but that want to be perceived, they want to wear wigs, female wigs, or put on a dress and self-identify as female and have rights. They want to be recognized as female, and they want to have rights as women. This is all a little confusing to me, but I asked him about, and of course, I thought maybe this is in some way that men want to, it's like a backlash against the power and rise of feminism taking over traditional roles that have been ascribed to men, and women taking on those roles. It seems to be okay for a woman to behave like a man, but not so okay for a man to behave like a woman. And maybe this whole thing is related to like a backlash against that, trying to take the power back. So this seems puzzling to me, and I confess that I don't understand it. So I wanted to get his take on it. And he said that no, it's just the process right now of the attaining of more sexual freedom. The basic archive, that program for male-female roles, are liquefying right now. They're melting down. And men who do this want to simply appropriate more sexual freedom. They want to, the roles are changing. They're swapping out, going back and forth. For me, this just sounds like total social chaos. This is the kind of social behavior that comes in the end phases of civilizations when they're losing their ability to organize society. And it just becomes very chaotic. But he says it's not a negative thing. And he said he wouldn't put a value judgment on it as positive or negative. It's just what's happening. And we are opening up to the freedom now for people to have the means, if they want to do this, then do it. I think it's very confusing, though. But, so I asked him about Homo habilis being the first of the genus Homo to have language, which is what I suspect, because as far as we know, Homo habilis is the first to begin making tools. And in order to make a tool, you have to be able to project a concept from your brain onto the rock to see it in a way that's not natural to the rock, but that you were going to shape it in accordance with. And that has to involve language. Language has to be in there. And the same area that's in the left part of the brain, I think, is related to the making of tools as is related to language. And so I asked him if he thought Homo habilis was the first to begin speaking. And he said that Shruti said he's talking about how language seems to have begun with the voice copying the sounds that things made. For example, one rock makes a certain sound when you bang it up against another rock, and then in your head you vocally imitate it. Click, and then the word click comes into being. So language begins with these concrete things that simply got more and more elaborate over time in history, until pretty soon there's a whole vocabulary and language for things that gradually has gotten more and more abstract. Of course, over the entire history of civilization, language has become deterritorialized from its material substrate in the physical world where it seems to have originated. And then I asked this question. I said, I have this thought that I'm wondering. Human sexuality is very creative. It seems to be way more creative and fascinating than what the animals have, who just get together, do the sex act, and go away again. But we like to do all different kinds of things. And I said, I was wondering about oral sex. For instance, animals don't do oral sex, as far as I know. Don't do oral sex, but humans do. And I was wondering how far he thought this went back. Does it go back to Homo habilis, which is what I suspect? If Homo habilis is the first to have concepts and begin to speak, then that might have been where oral sex began. It comes in with human intelligence. So it actually requires a concept to do it, to pre-visualize it as a concept in your mind. And he said, well, she said, well, yes, he agrees that intelligence is required for it. And we all laughed, which I think is very funny, actually. And he said, yes, probably. It's tied to language, and it's tied to, all the things that we do sexually. So much mentality is involved with the human mind. A lot of it is just mental. Two people can have sex without even touching each other. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, he means through language. We can have sexual relationships with each other just through language alone. We don't even have to touch each other. And so a huge amount of human sexuality is based on intelligence and mentality and language, which I find very fascinating, the way the human mind has hijacked and deterritorialized all the basic sex acts. And so I continued on this line of thought, and I said, what about, do female animals have orgasms? Because I don't know. How would I know? Do they have orgasms? Or were female orgasms an invention of humans? And he said, no, they do have orgasms. Female animals do have orgasms. And he says it's a necessary thing for them. I wondered, well, what is the function of the female orgasm? If it's not related to ejaculating sperm to create new life, then why is it there? He says it's there for a lot of reasons that have to do with certain chemicals and hormones that get triggered and are released by the orgasm, certain emotions, happiness, certain feelings that are all connected with these chemicals that are released. And so it does in the female body. So it does have a purpose, and apparently female animals do have orgasms. So then I asked, do the dead experience sexual desire? And now I guess this brings us up to where the video is. Yeah, all the rest of these questions can be found on the video. So I guess that brings us up to speed. That's everything that we discussed over the first hour. And of course, I'm probably missing a lot of details, but those were the essence of the answers to the questions that I asked him for that first hour. And then if anyone wants to see the rest of this, they can just pull up the actual remaining 25-minute video that I put on there. Any donations to my Patreon account would be very much appreciated. That would help keep these projects going. Shruti and I have a lot of plans to interview a lot of other very interesting entities, some of them not human. So if you want to see that stuff keep happening, patronage on my Patreon account would be very greatly appreciated, no matter what amount. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this.